Hello, everybody, and welcome to EarthX CEO, a weekly series on EarthX TV. Each week, we speak with business presidents and CEOs about their leadership on sustainability and climate change issues. I'm your host, Bob Perciasepe, president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. And with me today is Ralph Izzo, chairman and CEO of PSEG, which is Public Service Enterprise Group, which is the main and the largest electricity provider in the state of New Jersey. Ralph has been in that job since I think 2007 and has a history with the company, unique in my mind in the industry, with a PhD in physics and an MBA. As well. And Ralph is a well-known leader in the electric power industry in the United States and one person who I've had the pleasure to work with through the years. So Ralph, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for the invitation.
So, in this era where everyone is trying to figure out how we decarbonize the economy, almost everybody will point to the fact that electricity has to be at the forefront of that. And you have been talking about this for quite a while, and being in a very strong leadership position with your company, but also in the industry. So recently, PSEG published a climate report, I think earlier this year in the spring. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that report, how it came about, and what your aspirations are with it?
Sure, Bob, I'm happy to do that. As you pointed out, our history, though, as a company with climate change and carbon reductions really does go back now almost 3 decades to 1993 and President Clinton's climate challenge. But we've evolved and matured as the whole conversation around the subject has evolved and matured. And I'm about to betray that maturity and sophistication by failing to remember the initials associated with the new set of standards that are basically a carbon disclosure type of financial standard that we've embodied in that report, which really speaks to the risks to our operations if we don't seek to take action, the impacts on our customers, the impacts on our employees, and the long-term sustainability of our company, which, as you know, like many utilities, is over a century old. So it really was a way to structure the dialogue and help educate others as to the amount of science behind the need to act and the very many ways in which we as a company are taking action to help our customers and simultaneously help our employees and shareholders deal with what I believe to be an existential threat, namely climate change.
Yes, I think the initials you were struggling for are TCFD. I struggle with the same thing because it's the Task Force on Climate and Financial Disclosure, and they leave off the force part. But it's important. It's important because that's a key reason more and more businesses are looking at climate change and sustainability together. Is that there's this financial risk and long-term sustainability of the company itself, and it's, I think, important that you guys have included that and built around that a little bit. So one of the things that's I'm not going to say unique, but certainly important to the plans that PSEG has put together is the role of nuclear power. And this is an issue that's been debated for quite a while in the country, and we find ourselves in a situation now where the value of those zero emission sources of electricity are growing. So tell me how you all have viewed that and your own views on the role of nuclear power, not only in New Jersey, but also in the whole country.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so from a statistical point of view, it's impossible to dispute the importance of nuclear power to climate change. Nuclear power produces roughly 20% of our nation's electricity. It's double that in New Jersey, it's 40%. But it's responsible for 50% of the carbon-free electricity in our nation. And in New Jersey, it's almost 90%. So if you were to eliminate nuclear power, existing nuclear power, you would be taking quite a huge step backwards in terms of our battle to minimize carbon emissions from the electric power sector, which is a close second to transportation, as you know, Bob, in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. So the existing nuclear fleet is an essential tool in battling climate change. I would agree that a separate conversation, perhaps with different considerations, might be warranted when talking about new nuclear or the future of nuclear technology. I happen to be a believer in that, but I do think that reasonable people might have a different point of view in terms of building new plants or new nuclear in the absence of a concerted strategy on how to manage the high-level radioactive waste in the nation. But to me, there's no disputing the importance of preserving the existing plants, which are under tremendous economic pressure for two reasons. Number one, the absence of a price on carbon allows fossil fuel plants to produce electricity at a cost advantage that is unfair from the point of view of it denies the long-term consequences, economic consequences of emitting carbon. Now, to compensate for that, what some public policy leaders have done is they've subsidized renewable energy, and that then introduces new supply into the market, which puts further pressure on the nuclear power plant. So nuclear is sort of getting hit with a 2x4 on both sides of its head. And there it sits kind of as a great ongoing and critical tool for the problem that you're trying to mitigate by introducing subsidies for renewables, but yet you're exacerbating the problem and not really attacking the problem at its core, which is to make fossil fuels pay for the externalities that are associated with them. So we're huge believers in terms of the need to preserve existing nuclear plants. And it's one of the 5 things that I speak about all the time in terms of what we ought to be doing to combat climate change, and nuclear, preserving those existing plants is preeminent among those 5 things.
Well, you've also, Ralph, been a leader, I think, in the industry in talking about the importance of energy efficiency and how that plays into this long-term plan. Simple answer is it helps stretch the resources. But talk a little bit about what you've been trying to do in New Jersey.
Yeah, so energy efficiency is number 1 of the 5 items we list. I'm just going to quickly list those 5 items and get back to energy efficiency. It's energy efficiency, number 1. Preserving existing nuclear plants is number 2. Investing in renewable energy, typically wind and solar, would be number 3. Electrifying the economy would be number 4, starting with transportation. And to help us choose among those 4 things would be to set a price on carbon so that we make the most out of every environmental dollar that we spend. But just to give you an example, in order to preserve existing nuclear in New Jersey, we do need a subsidy of about $10 per megawatt hour, which translates into about $17 per ton of carbon removed, way below the social cost of carbon as articulated by the US EPA and by the National Academy of Sciences. So it's a prudent investment. And because of our location on the planet, that's a lot less expensive than solar and wind. However, even though I am boasting about nuclear in that case, I need to point out for energy efficiency, we were recently granted approval by the State Board of Public Utilities to invest $1 billion over the next 3 years in energy efficiency. And based upon our preliminary analysis, now we haven't implemented the program yet, but we have implemented similar programs at a smaller scale in the past. That $1 billion in investment will create over $2 billion in energy savings, so a net savings of $1 billion. And at the same time, remove 8 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere. So you literally have the ability to reduce carbon while lowering customer bills. You could think of that as a negative cost of removing carbon from the atmosphere. A hallmark of PSEG is that we really strive to achieve public policy objectives through a win-win opportunity. And I call energy efficiency the quadruple win. First of all, it's great for the environment. We're going to burn less coal, less natural gas, use less uranium-238, use up less land to build solar farms and wind farms because we're going to need less energy. Number 2 is a benefit to the customer. Their bill will be lower. Number 3, we get to employ, this program, we expect to employ either directly or indirectly over 4,000 people to effectuate the programs. And then through a regulatory system that allows us to recover our fixed costs and earn on the investments we make in energy efficiency, our shareholders actually have a new investment opportunity and get to make some money on this. So it's good for the shareholder, good for the employee, good for the customer, and good for the environment. So it's not fairy dust. I mean, that's the essential ingredient of energy efficiency. It's a smart way to do business.
Yes, and that's great that you're embarking on that kind of investment and with those kinds of payoffs. We've talked about nuclear a little bit, and you've talked about efficiency. One of the other 5 points that you made was expanding renewable energy, and you made an important point just in the last conversation about related to siting and land use. You didn't explicitly say that, but how do you look at that in a mostly densely populated area like northern New Jersey and even in the western part of the state? How do you go about thinking about siting, and are you guys thinking about offshore?
Yeah, so it's a challenge. So New Jersey was an early adopter of distributed solar, rooftop solar, and quite proud of it. However, it is expensive to the point where it doesn't make sense to me. And that's a painful thing to say, because I've been a climate change combatant, candidly, since 1986, even prior to coming to PSEG. But when solar renewable energy certificates consistently sell for between $200 and $250 per megawatt hour, yielding a carbon mitigation price of $400 to $450 per ton, and tend to be subsidized in a very regressive fashion, you realize that something different needs to be done. And to the state's credit, it's now, while it continues to support some rooftop solar, it's focusing more of its attention on offshore wind. That too needs to be subsidized, just given the infancy in which the industry exists in the United States. But at least the first contract in New Jersey that has been awarded looks at about a $98 per megawatt hour price, which, if you subtract the cost of electricity and capacity in the state, looks like more of a $50 per megawatt hour subsidy compared to a $200+ per megawatt hour subsidy. It's still expensive. That still back translates into anywhere from $75 to $125 per ton of carbon mitigation. But one has to hope and expect that, given that it's a first of a kind project, that subsequent projects will be lower cost as we learn to work around the Jones Act and various other limitations that offshore wind encounters here in the United States.
Well, a last question revolving around those points, is the electrification question. Yeah. And particularly, you mentioned transportation, which is now the #1 source of emissions in the United States. How is PSEG approaching electrification of transportation in your plans, and how you're working with the utility regulators?
So we've done some things to help our own employees benefit from electric transportation, either in terms of encouraging mass transit, which is mostly electrified in New Jersey in terms of trains, and then having charging stations at our major employment locations. But we've gone to our regulators and asked if they would not allow us to invest $300 million in electric vehicle charging infrastructure as a way to sort of get this chicken and egg conundrum, if you will, resolved. New Jersey, by most views, should be a great place for electric vehicle penetration. We're a highly compact state with short commuting distances. Regrettably, our air quality is challenged. We tend to be a high per capita income state. So those factors would tend you to think that we would have a fairly high concentration of electric vehicle purchases, but we don't. And as best we can tell, this is the whole notion of range phobia, that notwithstanding those short commuting distances, the the ability of customers to purchase electric vehicles, which are not inexpensive, although getting less expensive. Customers or potential customers are just worried about the lack of charging facilities. And I think it's pretty safe to say that those states that have enjoyed a high penetration of electric vehicles have turned to utilities to get that industry underway by building out some of the infrastructure early on to build that consumer confidence in the ability to charge their vehicles. So that's what we've asked the Board of Public Utilities. And we've been completely open with the fact that what we need to do to get that up and running may not be the right solution over the long term. If the market rushes in after the infrastructure is built and people start buying cars, and then therefore maybe there are new entrants who want to build more infrastructure, then we could exit the business and sell those assets and return any benefit that's realized to customers. But I think to be the initiator is something that would be wise to do, and we're in close conversations with our regulators. I think we'll have it resolved probably by the end of the first quarter next year. But what that resolution is, I'm not quite sure just yet.
Well, I think that's a smart move. It's a growth area, if you want to think of it from a business perspective, but also I think help stimulate a transition that we all know has to happen, and that's a reasonable approach. Let's switch from your plans now to you as a leader. Anybody who's listened to the last 10 minutes of conversation, I think can see your passion for moving forward on these issues. But when you think of this and your other responsibilities of running a corporation and all your fiduciary responsibilities as well as management responsibilities, how do you mesh that up with your own leadership style and motivating the company to embark on these initiatives, getting the plan done, going to the Board of Public Utilities? All these things require, an extensive amount of energy, no pun intended. And so tell us a little bit about your personal management style and leadership in this area.
Yeah, so for me, Bob, I mean, other than maybe housing, healthcare, and food and clothing, energy is sort of close to that group in terms of being the lifeblood of the way in which we live and our economy and our lifestyle. I don't kid myself. I didn't wake up this morning, and I know nobody else woke up this morning saying, I can't wait to use a kilowatt hour. But maybe they did wake up this morning and say, I can't wait to watch that television show, or I can't wait to get back to this book I was reading last night, or in the hot summer, oh boy, turn that air conditioning on, I can't deal with this anymore. So energy is something that we realize universal access to it is critical. It's more of a tax on living and a means to an end than it is an end in and of itself. So for a 100-year company to aspire to be around for another 100 years, I think our alignment with public policy is essential. And because the consumers don't have a choice, they can't say, we don't want energy. What they can say is, we don't want energy in that form, or we don't want it delivered that way. So it's important to me that our company be viewed as the #1 corporate citizen in those places where we operate, and that we are completely in sync with the entire customer base, and that we stay ahead of trends so that we can be viewed as someone that can help inform the direction of those trends. And that's not unique to Ralph Izzo. That was true of my predecessor and his predecessor, and in fact, the founder of our company. So I would say that alignment is essential to the way in which I think about running the company. You then think about that and marry it with the inherent culture of our employee population. We cannot move our pipes and wires. And it's really tough to move our power plants, as few as they are now. What that tends to mean is you have an employee population that is deeply rooted in its community. You have an employee population that understands, values, and respects the importance of safe, reliable, affordable service, which tends to be employees that then look towards a secure and have a longer term view of their careers here. All of that then points to you can't operate on the premise of what's good today but might not be good tomorrow. And my introduction to energy started with concern over energy security. And then it quickly evolved because of the good fortune I had to meet some leaders in climate change, to my recognition of the importance of energy to the environment and climate change. So that issue, combined with the longevity and the sustainability of the company, has just made it very easy for us to champion issues like the Clean Air Act amendments and what it meant for mercury and fine particulates and a variety of other quote unquote traditional pollutants, and then segue over to what for many decades people thought was harmless, right? It's what makes the bubbles in our soda, carbon dioxide, but what we've come now to realize is a significant pollutant.
Yes, it's universally true. Of too much of good things sometimes can cause problems. And that's obviously we need carbon dioxide. Plants won't grow without it, but if we have too much, then it creates these other issues. And I appreciate those thoughts there on the company and your personal views of these matters. Let's shift to another quick part of the discussion here. You've mentioned several times, and you just did, alignment with public policy. There's sort of a two-edged sword there. You have these goals that you've put into your plan, and I think if I remember near the end of the plan, it says, we will need some public policy to help achieve the final 100% net zero by 2050. And you've mentioned aligning with public policy. So there's this growing symbiotic relationship, I think, between the aspirations of companies, particularly power companies, and the alignment with public policy. And you mentioned a price on carbon. What are some of the public policy priorities you feel that the country really needs to come to grips with over the next decade, let's say?
Well, you nailed number one. It's a price on carbon, and there are multiple ways to do that. Candidly, we're quite fortunate as a company. We have in New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, who is a true believer in climate change and the science and the need to battle it. And that makes for a very easy conversation with him and a great way to be able to get agreement on energy efficiency and preservation of our nuclear plants and things of that nature. Unfortunately, in New Jersey, we've inherited this system, so to speak, where there is no national price on carbon. So in New Jersey, carbon mitigation is viewed as something that could be $400 per ton, the solar subsidies we talked about, $100 per ton, the offshore wind subsidies, $17 per ton, the nuclear subsidies, or negative $125 per ton, the benefits of energy efficiency. That doesn't make economic sense, right? I mean, that just, instead of turning into rational decision-making over how to battle climate change, becomes a contest of who's got the best lobbying skills to garner whatever subsidy they need to preserve their technology. And you see this at the national level too. The absence of federal leadership has resulted in states taking it upon themselves. So a solar renewable energy credit sells for $200+ in New Jersey because we require that credit be produced in the state. I don't know what the number is in Arizona, but I got to believe it's probably the low double digits, if not the high single digits, for a solar renewable energy certificate. And if we just treated the United States as a single resource, yes, we'd have to build more transmission to get power from location A to location B, but you'd have a far more efficient use of resources. And even though I view climate change as an existential threat, I realize that for many of our customers, getting a third meal on the table is their challenge today. Paying their rent is their challenge today. And all of that's been obviously compounded and exacerbated by the pandemic and COVID-19. And how do you tell those folks that $600 million a year in subsidies that are being paid to rooftop solar is a good investment in New Jersey? That's just not a conversation I'd want to have with someone who's struggling to make ends meet. So if we did have a nationwide price on carbon, and I'll just pick a number, $50 per ton, I think that produces about $250 billion a year. I would certainly defer to elected officials on how that money should be spent. I would put some of it into research and development to further bring down the price of renewable energy, inclusive of putting money into carbon capture and storage, because I do think that natural gas is a fairly clean fuel that we should be able to rely on for many decades to come. But you could dividend some of that money back to lower incomes. You could reduce tax rates. You could reduce the national debt. You could invest in infrastructure. I mean, in general, I think it's a good idea to place a price on bad things, to tax bad things and to not tax good things. And I think wealth creation is a good thing. I think that emitting carbon is a bad thing. Now, that would suggest a simple carbon tax, but you could have a cap and trade system to provide an implicit carbon tax, so to speak, or back into a price on carbon by virtue of the rigor with which one allowed allowances to be issued. My guess is that we're going to end up with something that looks more implicit rather than the explicit price through a tax or a cap and trade system, something that might arise through a clean energy standard. And at this point, we just need to do something. So I would be supportive of that, but I think that that's not as efficient a market as one that gives you a visible, transparent price, which would come either from cap and trade or taxation.
Yeah, I do think there's some alternative ways, as you pointed out, and we have to figure out how it gets through the political meat grinding.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But those are all good points. And so look, maybe you brought up the pandemic. Obviously it hangs over all of us on these days. But most people think it's likely to happen that Congress will eventually realize they have to do another stimulus of some kind or another, given the economic impact. And while there's been an impasse leading up to the election, whatever the outcome of the election, it seems like they will probably turn their heads back to that. Do you have any thoughts on where a economic stimulus, other than helping people right away and directly, as you pointed out, food on the table, rent, things of this nature, which probably need some shoring up. But if we were able to start moving some of the stimulus to infrastructure, where would you see some beneficial expenditures of federal dollars? This is short of a federal price on carbon, but just maybe something might happen sooner rather than later.
Yeah, there are three areas that I would think would be particularly fruitful, and two of them we've done here in New Jersey. Number one is just massive investment in energy efficiency. The beauty of that, by the way, Bob, as you know, is that oftentimes some of the jobs in energy efficiency are jobs that people can easily be trained for. So a lot of today's dislocated workers could be readily trained to do household energy audits, simple lighting installations, simple thermostat installations, weatherproofing, and things of that nature. So a major investment in energy efficiency, I think, would benefit jobs, lower bills, and the environment. A second area is that, and this might be a little bit more limited, but we are in discussions with leadership in New Jersey about increasing the amount of investment that we have in replacing our old gas pipe system, which tends to be old and leaky, with just newer, less leaky technology. I'm talking about removing cast iron, bare steel pipes and replacing with plastic. Because we do believe natural gas is going to be around for a while as a heating source and a cooking source. It won't be forever. And hopefully we'll have some carbon capture and storage technology to help mitigate the results of that. But replacing aged piping infrastructure, I think, would be a great way to reduce fugitive emissions of methane, which, as you know, over 100 years has about a 25 to 30-fold bigger impact than carbon dioxide. And the third and final area, which would be an interstate investment, would be creating greater incentives for utilities to invest in transmission. So we could take the resource-rich regions, which tend not to be the population-intense regions, and move that renewable energy to those locations where people live and could use that supply of energy. We had started making some progress in that regard years ago, but I think it's been diminished in its emphasis of late, and that's unfortunate, because I do believe that that renewable energy has an important role to play in a carbon-free future, but only when it's developed in those places where it makes the most sense.
Well, I think that those are all wise investments that the country can make that will have the co-benefits of helping stimulating economic activity, which I think
Absolutely.
we're going to need over the next year. So we'll see how that unfolds. Believe it or not, our half hour has been come to an end, and I really want to thank you, Ralph, for spending the time with us, and I want to also thank you for the leadership you provided to the industry and also to the state of New Jersey. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for all your years of service at EPA and all the wonderful things you've done, both as a public servant and subsequent to that now as a leader of an essential NGO in this topic.
Well, thanks. Well, that's it for this show. Thank you all for tuning in.